Good morning, wherever you are quarantined. My name is Jonathan Kutab. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Arab Center at Washington, D.C. And in the name of the center, I welcome you all to this important webinar. I am sure that there is no event in modern times that calls as much for an international, unified, global response than the epidemic that we are experiencing right now. One would think that international and international organizations were created specifically and precisely to deal with such an event, which cannot be handled by any single country, which impacts the entire world, which by its very nature calls for a global response. Yet we do have international organizations, international structures that in theory at least were supposed to handle this type of event. Today we have a very celebrated panel that will be dealing with this question. A panel of experts in international law and international organizations and international cooperation. The full bio of each of them is available on the website, but I will briefly introduce each one of them in turn. I think I will start with Jean-Luc Bushi from Geneva. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Bushi. I think that I would like for you to start us off with some comments about the World Health Organization and the structures that are dealing with this epidemic. So, Mr. Bushi, please start.
Many thanks, and thank you for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well. Zoom is a great thing, but sometimes technology goes only so far. So I hope you can hear me and see me well. So what I would like to do also, because many people are not familiar on what exactly WHO is doing or what it's supposed to do, and also what are these famous or infamous international organizations, international health regulations that we are talking about. What is the merit also of President Trump's criticism of what WHO hasn't done and should have done. To give maybe an introductory overview, hoping that so we have a better basis for discussion. First of all, obviously the pandemic as it is unfolding now goes way beyond health. Is destroying livelihoods, societies, economies. It becomes something of the unprecedented magnitude. But health seemed to be at the center of it. And so in a way, the world for a long time has tried to agree on legal, political, and institutional tools as a first line, as a main lines of defense against these events. And let me also add, and that's something that is not well known at all. The WHO is not the first organization in the field of health, and the international health regulations that were revised in 2005 are not new. So this is an old dilemma for the world since countries and people started trading, started traveling more freely, the people, animals, plants, merchandise, means of transport bring with them pathogens. And so globalization and freedom of movement brings the risk of disease. And the faster and the more global this movement, the more risk we run. And so the more important are these common tools to try to agree on a common defense, because what is evident is that individual states in isolation don't go very far. And I think if we needed a lesson, COVID is giving us a lesson. So WHO was created in good part to do many things because its mandate is very broad. It's not only about infectious diseases, but the core, if you want, is precisely this, is dealing with communicable diseases and trying to help the world in containing and preventing epidemics. It does so in many different ways. I'll say something at the end of this presentation, but one of the main tools that it uses and again, it goes back in time since the beginning of the 20th century, is a legal tool. Is what we call the international health regulation. So first of all, the regulations are a legally binding instrument. It's like a treaty. And its legal basis is on the constitution of WHO. It's adopted in accordance with the constitution. Unlike a treaty, you don't have to sign and ratify to be bound. But if you stay silent, you're automatically bound by a certain deadline, unless you opt out. So it's quite striking in 1946 to have this kind of instruments that really restrict, if you want, the actual freedom of states not to be bound quite considerably. There's a lot of pressure to stay on board, not to jump ship. And that is why the current regulations are in force for 196 states. So they are really, truly universal instruments. So what are these regulations supposed to do? What are the obligations of states? What is the purpose? And how did they fare in the COVID crisis? First of all, there are many, I think, misunderstandings and sometimes misperceptions. They are not like a magic wand that can materialize billions of dollars and thousands of people to go to the scene of the crime where the outbreaks are occurring. But fundamentally, it's a tool to allow countries to do a number of things, to do coordinated surveillance, because you need to get the disease very soon, detection, what are we talking about, containment, let's try to contain the spread, and response. And also, it's a very modern instrument because it represents a response to the globalization of risk. What spread the disease today is not only a COVID kind of situation, but it can also be a nuclear accident. It can be an act of bioterrorism. It can be a chemical spill in a river that spreads disease and poisoning across international borders. So it is a very modern instrument because it captured all these events. And that's why also it's highly political. It's not just technical. If you talk about bioterrorism, obviously we go into the core of international and national security. So what is it supposed to do? How is it supposed to work? There is a role for WHO and there is a role for states. States have fundamentally three sets of obligations. The first, they need to have a strong national health system, what IHR call core capacities, because they need to have a system that is first, can sustain the shock, can manage the disease, and can also prevent a spread to other countries. It's really a basis on international solidarity. And as you can see, this has not worked terribly well. And there's a lot to say of why. Wrong investments, underinvestments, wrong models of healthcare, excessive privatization, and so on. But it's a huge challenge, and there will be a lot of work to do to try to improve the record of public health systems in developed and developing countries. The second set of obligations is exactly what China has been criticized for. Every country is obliged to assess the event that it happens on its territory, even if it cannot put a label. If something unusual is happening, it's supposed to run it through an algorithm, and if it checks the boxes, notify WHO immediately and continue to cooperate, provide information, provide data, provide its analysis, provide a sample of the virus if it's necessary. So it's obligation of transparency, cooperation, and good faith. And the third set of obligations is when they take national measures, they are not prohibited from doing so, but they do so rationally on the basis of risk assessment, on the basis of evidence, on the basis of good science. That these responses are not excessive, are not arbitrary, are not disproportionate. And unfortunately, again, that's what we are witnessing today. Trade restriction, closing borders, things that frankly have not stopped the disease, but are causing immense disruption internationally. What does WHO do? WHO, first of all, many people are pointing fingers at WHO as if it was the engine of this whole thing. But the real bearer of obligation are states. WHO is there to support. So it participates in this joint surveillance. It's sort of supposed to provide alerts, it's supposed to provide guidance, and it's supposed to provide a soft coordination through recommendation. WHO cannot bind states, can recommend, can give guidance, can show evidence, can provide information, and so on. The culmination of this process is for WHO, for the Secretariat, not member states, to declare what we call a public health emergency of international concern. The WHO, that the Director General Tedros declared at the end of January with regard to COVID. And that's, it seems like a technical task, but it's much more than that. It's intensely political because WHO can declare it even against the will of the states where the disease is occurring. And it's a moment of alert that tells the world that the event has reached a certain level of gravity and we need to come together to coordinate response. And obviously has also political symbolism that can generate reactions nationally and internationally. In the case of COVID, this alert function probably has been missing a bit because the whole world was watching China well before the Director General declared the emergency. And that was one of the sources of criticism. Why did you wait until the end of January? So this was, if you want, the grand bargain. States like WHO to take an active role. It codified what WHO was already doing before and what it did successfully in the case of the SARS outbreak in 2003. At the same time, states were not ready and are not ready to give like binding power, like police powers to WHO. And so they retained the right to take their own decision based on their own risk assessment when they think is the best thing to do to protect themselves. That's a grand bargain. Has that bargain worked well? Yes and no. Certainly an instrument of like the international health regulations, like supported by WHO, has a chance if it can have an effect much earlier. If you are in the middle of a raging pandemic, I think it's not terribly relevant. And so what do we need for the future? I think first to, in a way, I believe, strengthen WHO because it's doing a good work insofar as it can. But it needs a clearer mandate, it's clear better resources, and it needs more political support, not this political division. If it's stuck in the middle of a geopolitical struggle between the US and China, it doesn't go very far. Whatever it does, it's a zero-sum game. The second is reform the international health regulation. You need a better system of alert. You need stronger investment in national health systems. You need a system to assess what countries are doing, which now is missing. And you probably need to rethink what this grand bargain is about. And third, there is a need, I think, to rethink the whole architecture. WHO is not enough. Trade is disrupted, transportation is disrupted, human rights are compressed to an unprecedented extent. So there needs to be a system-wide approach. Whoever has worked in international organization knows that coordination is a nightmare. Nobody wants to be coordinated. But if there is a chance of a better response in the future, it's also involving other sectors, trade, transportation, civil aviation, maritime communication, and so on, international financial institution. That would be a huge challenge. I hope the states will take this approach because right now we would need a forum to get states to agree and to coordinate the trade restriction, the travel restriction, don't block food, don't block medicines. And that is missing. That is really, if COVID has revealed something, is the absence of a more holistic system of prevention, response, and coordination. So do we have a window of opportunity? Everybody's panicking, but the window will close. And so I hope that there will be a serious discussion that will go way beyond WHO on how to better prepare the world for the next pandemic, because the next pandemic will come again, unfortunately. I'll stop at that and very happy to take questions later. Many thanks.
Mr. Bershi, thank you very much for your very informative introduction. Clearly, you could have gone on and on to speak about specifically what happened this time and how it can be changed. I'd like to alert everybody that there is an opportunity to send in your questions. We already have a couple of them. You just click at the bottom of your Zoom screen at the Q&A and type in your question. It's the same as submitting your questions. Other questions can be sent if you're not following us by Zoom to the website of the Arab Center itself. And then it will be sent to me and we will direct it to one or another of the participants. I'd like to now, because of the issues of time, switch to Professor John B. Quigley, a professor of international law, to help us better understand how the structure of international law operates so that if it needs to be improved or changed, how do we go about it? Professor Quigley? You have the floor.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to give what you might call the big picture of how the World Health Organization fits into the international system. The World Health Organization is established by a treaty. You've heard that from Mr. Burchi already. And you have a treaty setting up the World Health Organization, and you have a subsidiary treaty on the international health regulations. So I mean, treaties are mechanisms whereby states agree to various measures that are deemed to be in the common interest. And health is one of the very most critical issues of that sort, because obviously health cannot be handled in isolation by each country of the world, especially when one is talking about epidemics. You do, in fact, have a treaty completely apart from the World Health Organization that deals with epidemics. That is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a treaty that dates from 1966 and has nearly all states of the world as parties. And that treaty deals with a variety of rights in the economic and social realm and obliges countries to deal with epidemics. I'm referring to Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which says that states recognize the right to enjoyment of physical and mental health, and that in order to achieve that, they will take measures for the prevention, the treatment, and control of epidemic and other diseases. That is a treaty that has an implementation mechanism. States are required to report to a committee that monitors their compliance, and the committee will criticize them if they are not complying. So that is one international mechanism that is wholly apart from the World Health Organization. But what Mr. Burchi was talking about does have a certain history. He mentioned, in fact, that all of this goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. In 1908, an office was established in Paris called the International Health Office. And then when the League of Nations was formed after the First World War, it took up the issue of health as a primary focus of its operation. In 1923, it began the operation of what it called a health committee under the League of Nations to deal with a variety of health issues and specifically with epidemic diseases. And that functioned all through the period of the League of Nations and was considered to be one of the more successful aspects of the work of the League of Nations. And in fact, so successful that when the United Nations was formed after the Second World War, it was decided to continue that kind of cooperation specifically through a new treaty. And that's how you get to the constitution of the World Health Organization, which dates from 1946. So the treaty that establishes the World Health Organization is called a constitution. And as Mr. Burchi mentioned, it is subscribed to by practically every state in the world. It was part of a series of organizations, and Mr. Burchi also referred to some of these, a series of organizations that we now refer to as specialized agencies of the United Nations, dealing with a particular field of international activity. And Mr. Burchi mentioned the need to coordinate with regard to trade and to travel. You have specialized agencies that deal with these kinds of activities. So there really is an institutional basis for the kind of coordination that Mr. Burchi is saying is needed. In aviation, you have the International Civil Aviation Organization. You have organizations dealing with trade, the International Development Association. You have the International Telecommunications Union. So there is a variety of organizations that are available for this purpose. There is also a serious need for better implementation. And that's what Mr. Bucci was referring to. There are some treaty mechanisms that do provide for much more than what you find under the World Health Organization. For example, with regard to chemical weapons, there is a treaty that deals with that subject and requires states not to use or to develop chemical weapons. And there is a committee that exists under that treaty that, according to the treaty, has the right to go in and do inspections about chemical weapons. In fact, if you followed the news from Syria over the last few years, you've seen that in operation in Syria. Now, Mr. Bucci said that there has so far not been a willingness to go to that length with the World Health Organization, but there is a model there that could be used to move in that direction if there is a willingness. Mr. Bucci referred to the lack or to the conclusion of a grand bargain that would exclude those kinds of things, but it's possible. The issue of torture is another one. There's a treaty against torture, but there is also a mechanism whereby states can agree under a general treaty on torture to allow for inspections of their prison facilities by a committee that will go in. So again, you have that kind of model in the international community for greater intrusiveness, you might say. The World Health Organization Constitution does provide for amendment, which would be one way in which some of these new mechanisms could be instituted. This is Article 73 of the Constitution of the World Health Organization, which actually has a rather liberal provision for amendment. It only requires a 2/3 vote of what's called the World Health Assembly, the assembly of states that are parties, in order to bring about an amendment. Of course, you do need the willingness of all states for an amendment to be effective. So if you have 2/3 voting for an amendment, but China and the United States vote against it, it may not be worth doing. But the United States has always had something of a rocky relationship with these treaties. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which I referred to, is a treaty that Jimmy Carter signed on behalf of the United States in 1977, but the Senate of the United States was not willing to give approval to it. And as a result, the United States is not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. With respect to the World Health Organizations, the United States has sometimes let extraneous considerations come in. In 1989, the state of Palestine wanted to become a member, and the United States threatened to withdraw funding from the organization. But I think I will leave this at that point. And I think I've said enough that we can have a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Quigley. I think, like all practitioners of international law, we're always complaining about enforcement. Many people have even given up on international law because there is no enforcement mechanism. But the process is highly political. And in the United States especially, it is very controversial because there are powerful forces who are not frankly interested in joining the rest of the international community on any issue. However, maybe we should think a little bit more about this from the political point of view. And we're very fortunate to have with us Professor Virginia Tilley, bringing the perspective of a political scientist, maybe. How does the United States deal with this issue, particularly now that it is so urgent? It is no longer theoretical. We are talking about people losing their lives, about the need to have a unified response. We have to think not only in terms of the detection and the containment, but soon we're going to be having vaccines. Will the research be coordinated? Will the vaccine, once it's found, be shared with everybody? Who will pay for it? Will it be limited to particular countries that have it? So, Virginia, Professor Tilley, please, you have the floor now. And remember, everybody else, you have the opportunity to ask our panel questions. We already have some interesting questions. Click on the Q&A or email your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. Professor Tilley.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You actually foreshadowed a lot of what I was going to say. I was asked to share some ideas about the challenges that this particular crisis is suggesting for international law and international organizations and what we call the international system sometimes. And this does bring to the fore the Trump administration, right? You know, I think a lot of us are really absorbed at a horrified fascination level with the daily news about Trump's actions and statements and so forth, which are so at odds with the ethos of international law and cooperation that that John put forward and that is detailed in the presentation by Professor Burci. I think we can almost see this as a kind of morality play for the epic turn of an era. We're especially Trump's posturing about the WHO and the UN, and even world community generally as a alien, foreign, disembodied global elites encroaching on American national sovereignty in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, this is a very strange thing to be witnessing. And it's really easy to be engrossed by the sheer folly of this, not least Trump's frivolous demands, scuppering a G7 agreement by insisting that everyone call the virus the Wuhan virus, for example. Doing the same to a G20 communique by health ministers by insisting on no mention of the WHO at all. I mean, this kind of silliness and pettiness can really distract us from some of the more serious issues. We have evidence of the Trump regime and through his, Jared Kushner operating the PPE supplies on a mind-boggling scale of corruption, which perhaps possibly to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars being scuffed off to private pockets, which may be the scandal of coming years. But all of this drama, this daily drama, is just one level, and I do think we need to consider what it means for other levels. I mean, on one level, it's very simple. Trump is an ignorant, bombastic demagogue, a kind of a loon. Has no knowledge of world affairs, no curiosity about it, no respect for facts at all. And his bombast just reflects an ignorance of history and a kind of malignant narcissism. None of this is really new. His foreign policies have been pretty dismal. I mean, his major initiatives have been either modest, as with the NAFTA renegotiation, or they've stalled entirely, as in North Korea, or they've dramatically backfired, as in the trade war with China. So I think the world has now come to see the dangerously incapable and ignorant man. And what do we do? Well, foreign governments try to mollify him and flatter him and count on this being temporary, and this too shall pass. He will leave someday. It's a democracy, and something like the status quo ante will return. But I think the problem behind Trump is much more serious than this, and it's probably more lasting for its implications for international cooperation. and institutions. For one thing, in the US, remain the domestic reasons he was elected. Some of this is a culmination of a decades-long Republican campaign to wreck our school system and leave populations vulnerable to conspiracy theories and sheer nonsense that is propagated to delude people. And they've also tried to foster a kind of nihilistic view of government of any kind, and cynicism and fear about the UN as a kind of a authoritarian global plot by shadowy elites to develop a one world government that will take away everybody's guns and subject them to tyranny. I mean, we laugh about this stuff, but there's a part of the population that really believes this stuff. There's also behind this more incoherent tensions about globalized production and a loss of sense of community and direction, of identity, perhaps. Some of us have gotten, like myself, have gotten very interested in identity politics because you see these people expressing these tensions in those terms. You know, what is America? America's being lost, America's being overrun, America's changing, these very racist tropes around this. But still, it's an alienation that is coming out of globalization and a kind of fragmented work environment people don't know how to interpret. I think it would be very much a mistake to see this as the coming trend. This is a minority of the population, and it has a liberal counterpart. So we have liberal, progressive, and reactionary sides both being steamed up, creating this deepening gulf between them. But that division itself, and it's not unique to the United States, it's happening all over the world, and this tension is forcing governments to look inward to try to resolve these internal political tensions that are really quite profound. They're challenging the nature of the nation state. And to do that, it takes their attention away from global cooperation. It takes away resources and energy and political capacity to deal with international affairs in any kind of coherent way, especially in democracies. And that brings us to this third level, which you alluded to, which is the kind of the storied liberal international order, which I'll just call the LIO for short. Liberal international order, including all of these treaties and laws and norms and forums and institutions that our colleagues have been talking about, which many of us consider to be extremely important, and which, when it comes down to something like a pandemic, is existentially important. We really can't deal with something like this without them. But we see in the US a lot of doubt and debate about this order. We see it among academics too. What is this order? Is it going anyway? Is there problems anyway? Is it even worth preserving? Some people are in doubt about that. But I think read broadly, and I think everyone on the panel would agree that the LIO is a rules-based system in which disputes are managed by mutually agreed treaties and procedures in accordance with hegemonic norms. And this is the post-World War II order that has not by no means prevented wars and trouble and suffering, but has prevented any large-scale conflicts, and has developed a rich body of institutions such as the WHO for dealing with everything from agriculture and food and poverty eradication to nuclear weapons and the global, even the global climate, although that's doing that poorly. And if anyone's confused about the value of all this or the importance of all of this, we might consider what life was like on the planet when we didn't have it, which can be kind of summed up as World War II. So I don't think anyone's of a mind to really get rid of this system that has been so laboriously built up. But the problem with this system, hang on here, just catching up with my notes here. The problem is that in this system, there has always been a hegemonic force. All right, the United States has dominated the system since World War II, in cooperation with important allies, the European Union, or the European states as they came together in the European Union. The US now has raised an alarm to this whole body of people that the United States is even capable of electing somebody like this. There's one theory that the whole liberal system is liberal because the US is liberal, and here it's elected this bat crazy sorry, that had a double entendre in this context, president. And it's at just the juncture where China is growing. It just surpassed the United States on exports just a couple of years ago. And it's at this crucial juncture that Trump has come into power and withdrawn the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other agencies and institutions and treaties that were vital to the US continuing to dominate this system. And that raises the question of who will. The first reaction to watching this horrifying withdrawal of the U.S., which is horrifying to some people because they kept counting on the U.S. to play this role, is that is to get rid of Trump. Let's just get him out. Marginalize this radical know-nothing base and restore the U.S. role and restore the importance of funding and function of international institutions that serve the international community. But I think that overlooks problems that some are calling just cracks or rips in the system, but it may actually be the whole fabric starting to wear out. I realize I might be going a little bit long here, but let me just make a couple of points. One problem is that the UN Charter, the UN system, the UN body of institutions and laws and everything that's been developed have always been, as has been pointed out already, steered by states. This is a club of states, and states make the rules, and states decide how they're going to participate, and they decide how coercive these rules are going to be. And then someone, although not an over-government, but someone typically enforces them through one kind of persuasion or another. That system is profoundly, fundamentally challenged by two factors that we have on our plate. One is global climate change, and the other is pandemics. They both threaten humanity in ways that the UN system, which privileges great powers, can't resolve, and recidivist nationalism can't resolve either. So the risk of losing the liberal international order is not so much interstate wars as it was in 1939. It's that these international institutions are coming into question for their alienating effects on working people. Just as we're facing life-threatening events on a global scale that require that these global institutions function as they have never functioned before. They have to function in a way that is actually more Trump's, Trump's state sovereignty in many ways. And then that calls for a new charter, that calls for a new system, a new step up, just as the United Nations was a step up from the League of Nations. Perhaps we are now confronting a crisis that may ultimately bring us to something that is much more like a world government than we had before. And of course, that then backlashes into recidivist nationalism yet again. I just close by saying that we have a problem here. I'm kind of rushing a bit, but it isn't possible to talk about international law without recognizing that the entire international liberal order is also a global capitalist order. I don't see capitalism going away anytime soon, but as you mentioned, this raises the problem that private interests are very much favored by the prison system, such as intellectual property rights, which private interests can gate, through which they can use. Private intellectual property rights allow private interests to gatekeep public access to life-saving treatments and suck enormous profits out of strained public troughs for vaccines, overpriced vaccines and so forth. The WHO itself is not immune to this kind of challenge. I mean, when H1N1 was a threat, there were charges that some WHO officials were exaggerating the threat to profit certain big pharma vaccine companies. Now, whether that was true or not, the suspicions were high, and it was reasonable to have such suspicions because private and public interests are so intertwined in the international system itself that for mere mortals on the ground, it becomes rather opaque and intimidating to even think about trying to solve them. And the result then is this populist reaction against even having such institutions at all, since they are seen as unaccountable. Now, China, of course, is winning the global international capitalist game. Right now, it's growing 3 times faster than any of the European or North Atlantic countries. It's putting forward the idea that its own command economy is the most efficient way to go. I think we know that that's not true, simply looking at their pollution levels and their corruption levels, which are astronomical. So I think the greater danger to the international system and international order from something like a pandemic may be the worst possible solution, which would be fascism, kind of a 21st century version of the old fascist nationalism, which in which states become very isolationist and competitive and xenophobic and reactionary. This is why I think it's not really wrong. I mean, although we can attribute Trump's behavior in this crazy government to kind of an aberrant passing phase that will soon be hopefully corrected by a tidy, predictable, boring Joe Biden as a kind of cutout for standard liberal capitalism, it would be a mistake to assume these battles will be over and that sanity is just around the corner. Trump's attacking the WHO may be seen as merely a petty and vindictive action by a flamingly ignorant man, but his nonsense tells us something about the larger forces at work and the inevitability of a crisis challenge to the international order as we know it. So I'll close on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think you are correct that this is not just one single person. The movement towards a national country first is found in many other countries as well. We have some very fascinating questions that I'd like to address to specific members of the panel. Before I give you a chance to interact with each other. There's a question from Amira Agharib, who says, what is the role of international law in the protection of civilians living in countries under economic sanctions that are deprived from getting funds during the pandemic? Not providing assistance would endanger the whole region and the world as well. Mr. Bershi, would you like to give that one a go?
I think Professor Quigley and Professor Ptiliam are better qualified than me. That's a big issue, and it's an issue made bigger also by the spillover effect of sanctions, because we have the recent experiences with Iran, with North Korea, where sanctions were supposed to be targeted and focused. But the huge spillover effects, like for example, banks being absolutely risk averse and freezing any dollar of the country under sanctions and basically making it impossible to perform transactions, to do things that were otherwise allowed. So I'm not sure that there are international law as magic solutions. The human rights system got involved with that. There was a general comment by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that Professor Quigley mentioned at the end of the 1990s about the importance of the respect of human rights, including right to life, right to health, right to food, and so on during sanctions. That sort of also states imposing sanctions cannot be oblivious to the fact that they cannot sort of totally deprive individual population of the basic rights. I'm not sure that, people sort of fell on their knees and saw the light after reading that, but that to me is an important message about the need to balance the sort of security issue with the respect for fundamental question of livelihood and so on. As you know, many, at least United Nations sanctions regime have monitoring bodies, the famous sanctions committees, and those can approve exemption, case-by-case exemption to sanctions. So there are channels to remedy what the question was raising. But again, I mean, the functioning, I think it's only limited, is not terribly satisfactory.
Thank you. another question that's addressed both to Mr. Quigley and Mr. Burshi from Mr. Nader Habibi from Brandeis University. The question is, once an effective vaccine for an effective treatment becomes available, is there an international health regulation that will determine how and at what price these drugs should be made available in various countries? Does a country or a private corporation have an obligation to make these drugs available at a regulated price? Thank you. Professor Quigley, you want to start with that?
Okay, I'll start, but I think Mr. Burchi will probably have more specific information. The World Health Organization is an organization of states, and corporations do not have obligations directly. So the question becomes to what extent the states can put pressure on private corporations to act in certain ways. And to date, that hasn't been done very effectively. But perhaps I'll throw it to Mr. Burchi to discuss under the international health regulations and whether something could be done in that mechanism.
Well, I accept the provocation. The international health regulations are silent on this. As I tried to mention before, the purpose is quite different. So to give a bit of a blunt, maybe oversimplifying answer to the question, no, there is no treaty or accepted instrument of international law that obliges states or corporations to provide medicine or vaccines to everybody at a particular price. There's an extreme fragmentation. And as Professor Tilly correctly said, the tendency and the economic and legal model has rather been the opposite. So to encourage innovation, to encourage research and development by allowing the inventors, largely corporations, to file patents, to claim exclusivity rights, and basically to reap a reward from their investment through prices, through monopolies and through prices. I think this system has been tested and will be tested severely now because, again, the COVID is so unprecedented. It really sort of questioning many assumptions that have led the conversation until now. And I think you are seeing the first symptoms of changes. You have corporations, big corporations, for example, Abvai, Gilead, Novartis, that hold patents to potentially promising antivirals that are already saying that they will not enforce the patents, that they are prepared to provide this medicine at cost. They see the writing on the wall. If they try to block access, to price most of the world out of the vaccine of the antivirals, this will have horrendous consequences. So I don't think that they turn into humanitarian, but it's what we call enlightened self-interest. You have recently countries and many actors that have come together in two aspects. The first in the upstream part, because before you have a vaccine in your arm, you need to basically to discover it, to do research and development. And you see an unprecedented level of cooperation among scientists that really crosses the political divide. American scientists working with Chinese, with Japanese, with German, with Swiss, and so on. WHO has been stepped in the middle of this. It has, for example, launched a solidarity trial that basically encourages institutions doing clinical trials to share the results of the trials, not to keep it to themselves, but to allow everybody else to see what's happening and to use those results to accelerate a development. We had 10 days ago a fundraiser that in a matter of hours raised $8 billion. Not very clear how they will be used, who will control them. That remains to be seen. But at least it gives you a sense that there is a big mobilization. It was very sad that among the major powers, the United States was the only one that did not participate in that meeting and did not pledge anything. So again, this aspect of international law is not where it should be in terms of access, in terms of equity, in terms of fulfilling the needs of developing countries and so on. I think you are seeing, after an initial very sort of beggar thy neighbor response, the beginning of a trend in the right direction, in particular in the search for antivirals and vaccines, so in the upstream part. How the downstream part will be managed remains to be seen. WHO does not have magic bullets. It can provide a platform for conversation among states, can be a broker to provide vaccine to developing countries like we did during the H1N1 pandemic. But in the end, it would be leadership and again, enlightened self-interest, but broadly enlightened by countries that will be prepared to forego profits to a certain extent, or me first, to have at least an attempt at universal access to vaccine. Also because if the vaccine is not universally available, will continue to be at risk. COVID can come back and is coming back. You see, even countries that are doing well, like Taiwan, like Singapore, like South Korea, they have second waves. If you have a vaccine, that will have to be used to stop it universally, globally. Otherwise, we continue to be vulnerable. So from that point of view, I think it changes the paradigm very much.
Thank you.
Jonathan, could I add to what Mr. Burchi said? What he said reminds me that there may be one legal mechanism that will work in the direction that he is suggesting, and that is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because that does impose on states an obligation to prevent epidemic diseases. And one can interpret that to mean that states have an obligation to deal with their corporations and to require the corporations to do what Mr. Burchi says would be in their enlightened self-interest. So the fact that it may be in their enlightened self-interest plus some pressure from states could possibly have some impact.
Yeah. Professor Tilley, I'd like for you to mention, what can we do? What can ordinary civil society organizations, professors, activists do to ensure that the very hopeful message of Professor Burchi is actually acted upon? That our country and other countries strengthen and abide by international obligations, and in fact, enter into new obligations in light of this unprecedented crisis?
Well, I would just suggest that there's a lot of NGOs and civil society groups already doing that, working very hard, impassioned people, dedicated people. We've been working on this for a long time, and we'll continue to work on this, I think, with greater energy. The problem I was trying to bring forward is that we are now deeply hampered by some deeper problems that societies around the world are going through. Poverty, right? Inequality is delegitimizing the whole system, right? Here are these governments standing up as though they're representing their people, and they're, skimming off profits, and the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and people are starting to get fed up with it. And in the United States specifically, we have a very grave problem with education. A lot of the schools around the country have, I think people would be shocked, people from Europe would be shocked by the state of our schools. We have terrible schools. We have terrible school books. We have terrible school facilities. We have people coming out of these high schools who cannot add or read or interpret the news or anything else. And that is going to have its own politics, right? And we're not alone in that. I mean, we're seeing this, enough people are around to vote politicians in from that point of view, that kind of incoherent, inchoate resentment, confusion, and fear of the international as a body in Brazil and parts of Europe, and we're seeing it in this reactionary stuff around the world, and it's not a passing phase. It's coming out of the same, as I said, it's coming out of the same system that, I mean, Dr. Quigley, Dr. Burchi are talking about the, what we would maybe here agree it's kind of the good side of all of this, the high-minded, the visionary, the, focused on health and welfare and the best interests of humanity and all of those high-minded goals and development on that side, but that is not going to gain sway with some of the populations of these countries as long as that same system is serving these private interests the way they are. I don't think this is just a crisis for health. I don't think this is just a crisis that was going to improve, hopefully, national self-interest. I think it's raising a crisis for the entire system. And that sounds maybe kind of grandiose, but I fear that that's the situation. I fear that more serious global governance is not going to be able to come together in an environment that's working this badly for this many people. And there's going to have to be some real shocks, I think, to get the political will together to alter the distribution of resources to change those equations before the kind of vision I think most of us share here can come about.
Yes, I'm afraid our time is running to an end, and I'd like to give the panelists a chance. There are still other questions open, but I'd like to give each of the participants 1 or 2 minutes to sort of conclude before we thank them and thank all of the viewers. Professor Quigley, you want to conclude with 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes, thank you. I think we've covered some extremely important aspects, and in particular that the international system is what we have. We have to work with it. There may be ways of improving it, and we're likely to confront reluctance on the part of states, as Mr. Burchi has said, to more intrusive measures. And this, I think, is where what Professor Tilley is talking about comes in, that civil society can play a role in pressuring governments, because we are in a world situation where populism and isolation is an element. But I think there is a possibility of working with the system that exists in order to improve it, so that the next time we have an epidemic of this sort, it will be better. The inquiry that needs to be done that hasn't been done yet as to the origin, I think countries like Australia are now pressing for more active measures to achieve this. That's a specific issue that I think needs to be addressed.
Professor Burchi?
I agree with Professor Quigley. I think we covered a lot of interesting points. My only conclusion, and I follow up on Professor Tilley said, because to me, there's a bit of a paradox, because I agree with her that it's not just Trump is a manifestation of a broader problem. And it seems almost like the bubble in which we grew up, of a liberal order based on rule of law, based on cooperation, based on multilateralism, made by a system of international organizations that are there by and large for the good, is really, if not crumbling, in crisis. At the same time, I think this crisis has showed that big government is essential. We are countries that have fared better because they had government that stepped in, they commanded compliance, they knew what to do. Big government. So on the one hand, we have, in a way, the reassertion of the government in the light of liberal attacks, small government, leave everything to the private. But on the other hand, the projection of the big government at the international level is teetering. So I find this an interesting tension, an interesting contradiction, and I wonder how it will develop in the future. Many thanks for inviting me again.
Thank you. Professor Tilley, did you conclude, or do you have?
I concluded, and I think Professor Burchi just summed up everything I would say.
Okay. I would also like to mention that this crisis is, however serious it is an ongoing crisis. There will be other crises in the future. We also have the whole issue of climate change and global warming that is going to be impacting all countries, and that is going to require an international global response. I think we are just scratching the surface. And I'm glad that the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. is engaged in this conversation, which I am sure will continue. I want to thank again our panelists and all who are observing us on Zoom or on the website, or who will see this in the future. We need to continue this conversation and hope for a better international order for the benefit of all humanity. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you, Jonathan.